Okay. Right now I'm working on hopefully a book on the Communist Party Workers' School. So I keep segueing from one finished project to the next as I find more about this world. How I found out about the IWO is previously I was looking at uh, immigrant newspapers, specifically Slovak, Polish, etc., um, coverage of race and how immigrants, to be crude about it, became white. But I kept seeing references to the CP and the IWO and realized as I learned more about them that they were obviously not only better on race, but really interracial and egalitarian. So I said, oh, I better find out more about this group. And then I did. Yeah.
Right now, and that includes this morning, I was working on a brand new library exhibit site on the IWO for the Kiel Center, which is one of the premier labor institutes and archives in the United States. And it's very exciting because it's going to coincide with the launch of this book, this online exhibit. Now, I heard of the IWO, but I heard about it on the Jewish end because I had lived in New York and grew up there, and also lived in Paris. And all of a sudden, I found myself dealing with a world of politics that I was unfamiliar with at age 20, but was somewhat plunged into by age 24 in terms of learning about how what was called Landsmannschaften or hometown societies actually organized in New York and in Paris, and often they were along political divides. And so I had to learn about the political divides. And then willy-nilly, 40 years later, I find myself at Cornell and all the confiscated archives from the organization called the IWO are there in, I hate to say this, 15 different languages. It's really 16 if one wants to include English. And so I plunged in. I think it's impossible to separate the history of the IWO from what happened with the Cold War. Having said that, we're also in that post-war period in which people are not joining fraternal organizations, particularly if they're born in America, and their offspring are less likely to affiliate in exactly the same ways that their parents or grandparents did. But what happened with the Cold War and with the way the IWO was shut down legally, which was unique in terms of the application of New York State insurance law and revoking its insurance license as a fraternal order, meant that it became a Cold War unique tragedy. And that also can't be separated from the fact that it was avowedly interracial and pro-Soviet. So all these things sort of came together, and then we have these what I call lacunae or gaps in historic memory in which people don't really want to remember just how leftist many Jews were, how many blacks were, and how the politics of the Cold War played out in terms of the civil rights movement.
Um, yeah, I would agree with all of that. I think also part of it is just the passage of time, and it's okay. 71 years is not a long time in other aspects, but the people who would directly remember it, and I think we found that out when we did the online conference. You know, we were very fortunate. There are some people who were about 90 who reminisced about their time in it, but unless you're somebody who really knows about what your grandparents did, you know, it's disappeared. But I would say that's only on top of. I think the main thing is either uh, fear of the Cold War or embarrassment. And people, like we were saying before, were deported or lost their livelihoods over membership in this group. So I think a lot of people, out of pragmatic reasons, chose to forget about the IWO, uh, and yeah, that's kind of a shame. Also, assimilation, and not just that there was less need for a self-insurance fraternal group, but people were becoming Americans. And already in 1940, for example, the Slovak branch of the IWO at their convention was saying, we're having trouble bringing in the next generation. How do we make our organization attractive? Um, there were people who maybe weren't as interested in learning the language or performing in ethnic plays anymore. They did consider themselves, and they were, of course, American born increasingly. So I think that uh, over time has led to this group being forgotten as well.
And I would just add to this that the need for fraternal benefits and society is a little different once you have a GI Bill and suburbanization. And you're going to end up again with that interracial aspect becoming both more salient and something that becomes harder as America changes.
Yeah, well, they did face pushback in many jurisdictions, and obviously in the South. Louise Thompson Patterson, uh, who went down to Alabama to organize, was put in jail, and because it was, of course, illegal to have integrated meetings in the state. And even though she was African American, she was fairly light skinned, apparently. And she was lectured by a young police officer named Bull Connor. You shouldn't be down here stirring up the you know who. Um, but it wasn't only the South, right? I mean, uh, uh, it was de facto in the North, but there was a lot of pushback over in Clifton, New Jersey, some of the integrated meetings that the IWO held, where the police would, try to break it up. So the hurdles were many. Um, the advantages were that, people who are committed and recognize, right, to use the old phrase, an injury to one is an injury to all, found the organization attractive because they understood uh, the material benefits, certainly, of the organization. But yeah, they were there to fight anti-Semitism, anti-immigrant xenophobia, racism, and so people found allies. Today, we speak of intersectionality, but Louise Thompson, again, was writing about the triple oppression of Black people, Black women, right? In the 1930s, women, workers, and racial minorities. And it was pretty amazing that, immigrants or second generation Italians, Poles, Jewish Americans, right, recognized those alliances and worked for all. And I think that has to be remembered today.
A simple but really cogent answer is that for Jews who came from the Pale Settlement or Tsarist Russia, there was an analogy. They looked at lynchings as pogroms, and they looked at Jim Crow as analogous to a system that they had suffered under without citizenship in the Tsarist Empire. And when immigrants of any sort came to the US, they found a hierarchy, a racialized hierarchy, and found themselves willy-nilly making choices or being put into that hierarchy. And the result was that many decided purposely that they would fit into that hierarchy, being one above what was on the bottom, which is what I would call the African diaspora in the US, as well as some other groups, including indigenous groups. But some, like what we see in the IWO, have put two and two together in this equation, and it means a lot to them. The fact that their politics were pro-Soviet also encouraged them explicitly in this regard, because there were many debates within pro-Soviet orbits about the question of race and how do you organize, and the question of what does white and black unity mean. And that slogan is phrased in many different ways and promoted in different ways in different years within the CP orbit. But these are people who took it to heart. And that's why they are picketing for the Scottsboro case, in which young men are arrested and have life-threatening sentences. And that is why they are busy picketing the Brooklyn Dodgers. And they're getting there before Jackie Robinson gets into the team. So their commitment is absolutely solid once they have figured out this formula of both no Jim Crow in the IWO and immigrants one, immigrants all. To them, these were not contradictory.
Just again, the fights, I mean, they were championing anti-lynching bills, not that they were enacted in the 30s, 40s. But Vito Marcantonio, who was a vice president of the IWO, the congressman from East Harlem, I mean, consistently, was talking about integrating the armed forces or proposing bills of that nature, and the IWO was backing those campaigns. They also, yes, integrating Major League Baseball. They would play games. The IWO had teams, and the teams were integrated. And in between innings, they passed out petitions, right? Sign and send to the Major League Baseball commissioner that we need, integrated baseball. On social programs, I don't think you can say they were the only group, but they were certainly one of the strongest advocates of what became the Social Security Act. They had a program called Our Plan for Plenty, which talked about universal health care. I live in Canada now, so I know it can be done. But this is 1940. They were talking about government extending Social Security to cover healthcare in the U.S. They have letters that are sent to the IWO. Max Badock, the general secretary, from Philip Murray, the head of the Congress of Industrial Organizations, saying they're one of the groups that has helped organize the steelworkers in the 1930s, late 1930s. So they were, and I don't want to say they were on the right side of every issue or in the forefront of every issue, but on things like Social Security, industrial unionism, civil rights, they certainly were part of a big part of these coalitions advocating these measures.
And they did so before it became what I would say popular to do this. We think of the civil rights movement as really an offshoot of the late 50s, early 60s. And we think of major organizations, whether it's the NAACP or various Jewish organizations at the forefront of this. But what if we start thinking about what it takes to have a groundswell? And that groundswell comes out in part of the notion of equality for World War II, which is more general, and does sweep parts of America, as well as the pushback that happens politically to that with the Cold War. But we also have a groundswell in which you start achieving sort of a critical mass of people thinking about what does it mean on an individual level, and what does it mean on a large level, because the IWO had lodges for its 200,000 members, to start working hand in hand. And so we start seeing not only seven-term Congressman Vito Marcantonio working with the Puerto Rican and Southern Italian community in East Harlem, we see IWO Vice President Louise Thompson Patterson organizing in Harlem during the Harlem Renaissance and later, as well as in Chicago. We start seeing Clara Lemlich, who's known famously for the strike of 1909, which has to do with the Triangle Shirtwaist Fire. We see these sort of people coming together, and they are interesting biographically and otherwise. And when we see that type of cooperation, it's a resource for the future to understand how does one forge an interracial alliance, knowing it's going to be contentious, not intuitively obvious, but that people think it's absolutely necessary in the Depression and in the 40s.
I don't want to deny the importance of Paul Robeson, Clara Lemlich, and Mark Antonio and others, but what I find important to remember was all kinds of grassroots activism at a time in which it was not taken for granted that civil rights was a great movement. I mean, in Chicago, there was an interracial swim-in at the segregated beaches of the lake there in Chicago, and the IWO organized it and said, we are going to go and break this Jim Crow beach. Similar things when a Black family moved into Detroit. IWO contingent showed up and welcomed the Black family and painted their house for free at a time when other neighborhood whites were less welcoming, to say the least. So I think that should be inspirational. That yes, all these micro acts of solidarity should be remembered and perhaps uh, emulated today. Yeah.
And IWO members really actually felt empowered when they wrote letters, signed petitions, went on a picket line, or whatever else it was they did, including collecting junk for World War II, because that was part of the war effort. So these are people who come together collectively and individually, and they're absolutely convinced their voice will make a difference and that they will change America.
This was the Cold War, which starts right away. I mean, they were alleged to be a Soviet front. By the way, there were some leaders who were explicit about their membership in the Communist Party, and it was not a secret, but estimates that only about 10% of the membership of the IWO, that about 189,000 members, were in the party. But that fear or Cold War campaign shut it down. But also, I think it was just the militant activism on behalf of civil rights. If you look at a lot of the anti-communist congressmen and officials, they were explicit as saying, that I forget which one said, just because somebody believes in civil rights doesn't make them a communist, but it sure makes you think. And the chairman of the House Un-American Activities Committee, John Rankin of Mississippi, was explicit in, what he found to be communism. Well, a group that is talking about racial equality was in his crosshairs. And for that matter, the U.S. Attorney General, Tom Clark, who puts the IWO on the list of the Attorney General's list of subversive organizations in December 1947, was a Texas segregationist and a group that was practicing, not just advocating interracial solidarity, was suspect to a lot of these players.
So just by way of explanation, it's called the Red List. The Blacklist we've all heard of, right? With the Cold War and the Hollywood writers. But the Red List is really what Attorney General Tom Clark put the IWO on. And of course, there's that historic irony that his son becomes Ramsey Clark, very well known in terms of his opposition to the Vietnam War, among other things. But once a group gets put on the red list, and the IWO spends many years in court with some of the most famous lawyers out there, Donner and Kanoy, um, it's very, very hard to get off the red list. And even though the red list was supposedly really for government employees, in fact, it affected everything. And so we have an insurance court that shuts down the IWO based on the fact it's on the red list. And 3 days before the Supreme Court is about to hear the last appeal, they get off the red list, which they didn't really belong on. So they were a fiscally conservative organization. Now, what do I mean by that? From the actuarial point of view, in terms of its reserves, any insurance company has to be able to cover its losses. So, how does the IWO invest its money? The way that very conservative actuaries would do, who are patriotic: cash, which is liquid, and US government bonds. We are now discussing almost everything that was on the books legally, and that was in contention. So they got penalized actually for being on a list they got taken off of, and also for actually having conservative insurance reserves that were overfunded from the government's point of view when the government made its case in an insurance court. And by the way, insurance courts are like immigration courts. They're not under regular US law, and they are state specific.
Yeah, and what to follow on that, what the ruling was that they are basically too solvent and too liquid, and said that that money might be turned over to the Soviet Union. They admitted that they were actuarially sound, but they had too much cash on hand. The New York Judge Henry Clay Greenberg ruled, and it might be turned over to our alleged enemies in 1954. And it's, as far as I know, the only time uh, that this kind of a ruling was used in insurance law, because they were ruled consistently for 24 years to be financially solvent, and actually, like, beyond solvent, like made these wise, like you say, investment decisions. But in the climate of the Cold War, it was turned against them. Uh, and there was a CPA member, I'm forgetting his name, but a variety of IWO members sent affidavits to the court defending them. And this CPA from Newark, New Jersey, said they've behaved perfectly under what insurance companies should do from a CPA point of view, but nevertheless, it was turned against them.
From all these trials, what we see is that there are a lot of questions about the interracial nature of the IWO. Not simply whether somebody in particular had a tie to the Soviet Union, though that also does get asked, and the changes in politics between the 30s and 40s. So the emphasis on the interracial and the fact that some of those who defended the IWO in court actually were not leftists at all. They simply didn't like the misapplication of an insurance statute to be stretched this way, tells you that there was a lot of resonance about what happened. This is a unique application of insurance law, and it took down the IWO. Can't sell insurance, you can't have a fraternal society. When you read a toolbox called the historic, because you need resources for the future. You have to understand both past contingency and future contingency, and you have to both broaden a story and contextualize it. You can't just do a lift and load. So what we're encouraging people to do is read this book because it's case studies. It's case studies, and they show that it's contentious and hard, and you have to think about how you can take lessons that may sound inspiring and yet understand the ways that they may or may not work for forming a future. But yes, we think that they can inspire to show that other people grappled with these questions previously, even though none of us has a crystal ball as to what will come.
Yeah, yeah. And well, obviously, I hope people buy the book and enjoy it. There's a lot of amazing scholarship in there. It's 13 scholars writing on various aspects. My chapter is not so good, but but I want to know
Good.
that's my suddenly I remember my grandma's self praise stinketh. But I hope people enjoy the book. Lessons that the IWO in general could bring to today. They genuinely, even by 1930, its founding year, these were people who believed in progressive Americanism. And I think it's powerful to remember patriotism is not wholly owned subsidiary of the right or conservatives. They saw what they were doing as in the tradition of Jefferson, Paine, etc., Lincoln, and nevertheless believed that there was not a choice that had to be made between one's ethnic or racial group and being a good American. And that's important, I think, to remember. They also understood the need to appeal to people's sense of fun. I mean, every IWO branch had a baseball team or a theater group or a singing society. So they were engaged in important political work, but there was no law that said you couldn't also build solidarity and esprit de corps in these ways. And they did a terrific job in that respect, I think. Yeah.
They brought community together through culture and sharing culture, but also shaping it. And it's that tension that we explore in the book. How do you shape a new culture and yet partake of the culture you come from? And become an American in the process. It's a wonderful story in many regards. And we find it gripping, and we hope you do too. One of the things that we see in terms of persistence, which is not to be taken for granted given what happened to the IWO, is we have Camp Kinderland, or a Yiddish speaking camp that eventually becomes English speaking over time, and also is a lefty camp. And we see that there are figures in Kinderland who are connected with the Jewish People's Fraternal Order or with the IWO more generally, and same with Camp Bochica. One of them that's interested us is a CIO leader of the Painters Union, was Weinstein, who's very busy organizing there, and he's organizing in Yiddish and in Hungarian, since he's an immigrant, and organizing a lot of union support. Kinderland's very big on labor. And this is a theme that you see constantly in the IWO, whether it's in the Mariners Union support, which is West Coast, or Painters Union, which is truly East Coast, or the Furriers, which is mainly, but not entirely, East Coast, because then they start expanding into Canada, to Quebec, and also to the swamps of Louisiana. So we see this very strong support for labor and how it's put into the after-school system and to the camp system, and how labor leaders are embraced. So, two of the most famous people in terms of IWO members and cultural animators are Paul Robeson, the singer, the polyglot, the everything, right? Who becomes an IWO member because his friend, Louise Thompson Patterson, who's a VP, recruits him. And he becomes one of the spokespeople for the IWO. He's not just performing at concerts, Ballad for Americans, or some of his other work. He actually produces pamphlets encouraging people to join the IWO because he knows how important the benefits are. And he really wants an interracial order in which people of African origin in America, enslaved or any other part of the diaspora, are fully embraced. And this represents his ideals. Now, we also have Langston Hughes. Bob, would you like to talk about Langston Hughes' involvement?
Yeah, well, Hughes was a good friend of, again, Louise Thompson Patterson, and some of his poetry books were first published by the IWO. We have a chapter focusing on his activism use in the IWO. He also organized with Louise what was called the Harlem Suitcase Theater, which was activist theater in, like it says, Harlem. And they did a play of his, Don't You Want to Be Free? They did other satirical plays in the late 30s, early 40s. Hughes was himself later called before the House Un-American Activities Committee. Uh, as far as we know, he was not a member of the party, but he saw the kind of interracial activism in the IWO as part of that broad popular front call for racial justice. And yeah, some phenomenal cultural producers who were involved in a big way with the organization, the IWO, that is. Yeah.
So the Suitcase Theater starts off in the Solidarity Lodge in Harlem as part of the IWO. And when Robeson's attacked, which happens pretty fast in the 40s after the war, the IWO has his back literally and organizes concerts on his behalf as fundraisers.
Yeah. And of course we know, right, his passport was pulled, right? So Robeson, that is, so his international singing and acting career was kind of ground to a halt. So uh, the IWO provided him with a lot of venues that he otherwise wouldn't have had in late 1940s and early 50s US.